After a quilt has been completely quilted, the edges have to be dealt with. And the most traditional way of putting edging on a quilt is to put traditional binding on it, just like this. And what you need to do is cut enough binding that will go all the way around your quilt. And if you have a king-size quilt, that's an awful lot. So you obviously have to join strips end to end to make enough. Here is an example of 2 pieces of binding fabric. I cut it 2.5 inches wide, put together the wrong way. You don't want to join the long pieces this way, because every time you fold it, it will pile up on itself and become thick and unsightly. So what you need to do is join the long pieces on the diagonal. And when you join them on the diagonal, like this, trim out the back. Every time you fold it, that seam winds up in a slightly different place, so you don't create the bulk that you do if you're doing this. So this is a no-no. Cut enough of your 2.5 inch wide fabric to go all the way around your quilt, plus about that much, maybe 9 to 10, 12 inches, so that you can adjust the binding so that the seams, like the seams here, will not wind up in the corners of your quilt, because that's too much thickness and that would be a nightmare to have to turn a corner with a seam that got stuck in it. So before you put the binding on the quilt, you have to figure out a way to lay it so that the seams here do not come anywhere near the corners. And it may take a little bit of adjusting, but it's always doable. So once I have all my pieces joined together, then I will have yards and yards and yards of binding, if that's what I need, that look just like this. Okay, a trimmed 45-degree angle seam and ready to go. Okay. So once the binding is completely made, let's pretend this is a quilt. Let me show you how I start the binding. Notice this is untrimmed, and that's the way I leave my quilts until the binding is ready to turn to the back. I don't know how thin or thick it will feel when I'm ready to turn it, so I leave it untrimmed for now. It's fine. Okay. Let's pretend this is my quilt, and I figured out to start it here. What I do is sew this onto the edge of the quilt with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, but my little trick before I do that is to open this up, turn this down at 45-degree angles, press it, trim this off, and then turn it back. And what that does is create a finished edge, so that when I come around with another piece of binding, I don't have to worry about a raw edge. It just gets tucked in here and trimmed, and I'm ready to turn with no raw edges. So that's a little trick that sometimes helps. So I've got this ready to go to the machine. I have turned my corner down. I'm going to start a few inches away from my start, so that I have a way to maneuver when I come round and finish at the end. Let's come to the machine. And leaving a few inches here, again, a 1/4 inch seam allowance, I am going to simply sew the raw edges of the binding to the raw edges of the quilt. But I want to stop when I'm just a 1/4 inch before the end. So take a pen or pencil or something and mark where you're going to stop at a 1/4 inch. And back tack. We want this to be strong. And turn around, and we're going to come out of the machine for a minute. Okay. The next thing I do is take the next side, and I'm going to turn it back. And you can see how my raw edges line up, and forward, with the folded edge in line with the top edge that I have left here. If my fold is too high, my corners will be dog-eared. If my fold is too short, they'll be rounded. So I want that to come right to the edge of the quilt binding. And now I can continue all the way down the next side of the quilt. I usually stop before I get to the end, and I check out my corner to see that it will turn and make a very clean mitered corner. Let's come back to the cutting table for 1 minute. And pretend that this is a quilt and the binding has been put on all the way around. Okay, here's where I started. There's the folded edge that I left. I tuck this in so I have a nice finished edge. And now the job is to turn this to the back and by hand hem the binding all the way around the quilt. When I come to the corner, I'm going to make a angle turn and try to get this as square as I possibly can. The technique for turning this in the right direction to continue sewing is a technique that I call fiddling with it, just so that it makes it nice and pointy. And that's it, all the way around by hand. It's a big job, but it's the last job that you have on the quilt, so that makes it nice. So much for hand-turned traditional binding. Okay.